Hello and welcome to a new episode of Sparts Talk. Today, as you can hear, it is not your usual host. I am Vincent, and the reason you are stuck with me is because Mansa is on the interviewee's seat. Hello, Mansa.
Hi. Sorry, this is just a bit weird.
Yeah, a bit unusual indeed. So, Mansa, you wear many hats in the International Communist League. You obviously are the host of Sparts Talk. You do trade union work as well, as a last week episode kind of indicated. And you are also the editor of Women and Revolution, which is a yearly magazine our international produces. And there's a brand new issue of Women in Revolution, which just got out. It has a beautiful cover. It is titled Youth Oppression in an Age of Decline, How to Fight for the Future. And I guess just to kickstart that discussion, I'm going to ask you two very simple questions. Could you explain to our listener what is Women Revolution very briefly? And youth oppression in an age of decline, what's a bit the concept or the idea behind this concept, essentially, and what were you trying to achieve?
Right, two very simple questions. I do with 64 pages. All right. Okay. Anyways, in all seriousness, sorry, I'm just a bit nervous because it's much easier to ask questions, and now I have to think of answers. All right. So Women in Revolution, this is a historic journal of our tendency. The International Communist League dates back to the 70s, I believe. But yeah, so it's a historic journal devoted to, as the name indicates, women's oppression, like special oppression in general. And the purpose is to be able to give more direct and focused attention to those questions. I guess maybe that's as basic a definition as that goes. This journal was relaunched last year after a hiatus of over a decade, and there's reasons for that, which the editorial of the previous issue covered, which I can link in the show notes. But yeah, so this is basically, to sum it up, special issue. It's unfortunately for now just in English. We do translate articles from time to time depending on what it's about. For example, our comrades in Greece just translated the Greek article on violence against women. But yeah, it's an Anglophone journal, for now published once a year. Of course, we'd like to increase that frequency, devoted to issues of special oppression, which in the Marxist movement, is about women's oppression, racial oppression, and in this case, youth oppression. So that's the theme that this issue has. Now, as for your second simple question, I mean, you'll maybe relate to this. You edit Spartacist. When we first start thinking of like, okay, we got to put out a new issue. You have one idea in mind, and then depending on what the question is, it can sometimes morph into something slightly different than you initially imagined. So after we put out the last issue on the trans question, it took a couple of months to do other work. And then I started thinking about preparing the next issue. And for me, I did really want to deal with issues faced by young people, like specifically. And why is that? I think it's a number of different reasons. And if you don't mind, I'll kind of just explain the evolution of how I sort of arrived at that. For a couple of years, I think one of the things that I've been wanting to deal with, not just me personally, but I think I've been wanting for us as a party to deal with, is a question of growing polarizations, like growing divisions. Now, of course, that's nothing new. There's divisions all the time. But I remember I took a trip to Poland like a couple of years ago. And when I was there, one of the people I was speaking to, they were talking about how in Poland at that time, you had a situation where young women were becoming more, you could say, like looking to, quote, the left or to sort of liberal politics, whereas younger men, especially in the question of abortion in Poland, and younger men were looking more and more to, right-wing parties or more traditional values. And I was like, oh, wow. I think that was for me, it kind of struck a chord in terms of, okay, young people, there's a new sort of polarization starting to emerge. Now, this is, once I started reading into it, it wasn't, particularly new at the time. But I think the more I just I guess, started just paying attention to it more and more. So, of course, you had with the Trump election, I think lots of studies where women overwhelmingly, look to the Democrats. Like there is a gender divide when it comes to American politics right now, because again, similar questions like abortion, women's bodies, etc., are one of the terrains of polarizations in American politics. So it's kind of things like this that were really getting me thinking about, like, we don't really talk, the left doesn't really, well, the left talks about young people all the time. They'll be like, well, young people are revolutionary, but then they don't really talk about youth and what's going on amongst youth in a serious way in terms of understanding the divisions, the shifts, the processes going on. So this was kind of what was mulling in my head for some time. And I thought it was about time to take up that broad theme of growing gender divides amongst young people. That's how it sort of started in my head. I think at some point, early 2025, there was a study that's been now cited a lot. It was done by King's College in London. It was about how Gen Z men across so many different countries are looking more and more to the right. They're more conservative than millennials and boomers, blah, blah, blah. And it's just becoming a thing. And I think anybody who's listening, who's worked or who has an intersection with sort of youth more generally, who's worked with young people, that will strike true. Increasingly, I know in Britain, the conversation on misogyny is becoming mainstream, and that's not just Britain. I think this issue, maybe a lot of the articles are Western focused, but it's really not a purely Western phenomenon. I know Japan, South Korea, this conversation's really big there as well. So these are things that are happening. And if we step back and we look at ourselves as, we're communists, we always seek to build a unity of the proletariat and of the oppressed, but then you get divisions that are like really pernicious and that I think a lot of the left doesn't take up in a very serious way. So I thought this is what we should try and provide an answer to, because there's what my actual curiosity on these things was. But I think the other side is that people confront these divisions in the workplace. You confront, for example, conversations amongst your coworkers where this will come up. So how do you deal with that as a communist, where you're not just either ignoring it or where you're not just, going with the flow in terms of like the existing arguments, etc. We can get to that a little bit more as well. But I think it was also like, what do you do with this? What do you do with the divisions when, for example, a conversation on misogyny comes up in the workplace? When you have coworkers who vote Trump, but you've got black coworkers, like how do you deal with these tensions as an actual militant worker? So it was also to provide answers. So that's the broad sort of,
Yeah. When you talk about those growing divisions, so obviously you alluded to it, you're referring mainly, because there's all sorts of division in the working class, and division is not new in the working class, right?
Yeah.
Religious, sex, etc. I guess you're referring partially to the new types of divisions, which are kind of a repetition of the old types, but like, the manosphere, the red
kind
pill,
of supercharged.
And the Nick Fuentes, Andrew Tate type of character, right, that are rising among young men particularly. And it's true that there are many studies which show how there's an increasing gender divide in terms of political opinion. Can you be just a bit more like concrete about what are we trying to solve? And
I think it's I think it's helpful to like paint a little bit of the picture in terms of these dynamics. And I think let's just start with the one you just mentioned, which is the manosphere. On the one hand, there's innumerable studies. If our listeners are not familiar with this, there's numerous studies. Just Google it, gender divide. Yep. It'll come up. And the mainstreaming of completely reactionary bigots like Andrew Tate, Nick Fuentes, who have you. Who's this guy who made the documentary recently?
Louis Theroux, right?
Yeah.
Oh no, but with the Hickey Talkie. Yeah. So he made that documentary. Yeah. This guy. So Louis Theroux made that documentary
Boomer.
in the man. So gosh.
Anyways, yeah. So let's talk about that division. So you have, I don't know when this happened, to be honest with you, because if you start taking a deep dive into the manosphere, some people, I listen to so many podcasts where you have commentators talking about, oh, well, this is really like going way back into the 70s and, this movement and had that movement and had that phase and so on and so forth. It's like, okay, fine. As you said, like, the chauvinism in society, in class society, is nothing new. So I'm sure there was some, rabidly chauvinist manospheric ideas going back to the 70s, whatever.
Of course.
But I think the fact that this is becoming a thing where young people are randomly just like, I like Andrew Tate, or young boys as young as, 10, 11, 12 are like Andrew Tate, and where teachers, for instance, say that misogyny is increasing, then you think that it's becoming a bit more of a social problem, where the government says misogyny is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have, I wrote the review of Adolescence, which if a non-British audience probably, I think, hasn't seen it. Excellent show. But anyway, so you got the manosphere. But then what it does, with the growth of like really chauvinist, misogynistic ideas amongst men, especially young men, what that does is it fuels this opposition. Of course it does, because women are going to be like, well, young girls are going to be like, what are you talking about? Like, of course,
yeah.
So what that does is it drives more of a reaction away from that, rightly so, but towards the existing answers, which is liberals and the feminists. Right now, of course, teenage girls may not be so super familiar with it, but if you start going into like, women in their 20s, that starts to come up. For example, this article from, when is it? 15th April. Yeah, 15th April 2026, so less than a month ago. It says, the new radicalism among young women. And this is talking about how young women under 30, they're becoming more and more, quote, what they say, radicalized, but in reality that they're becoming more and more hardened feminists. A layer of them, anyways. So you have this like self-perpetuating cycle, if you will, where right-wing trends amongst boys and men will drive, feminist reaction amongst women. Now, that's maybe you might object and say, okay, well, that's crude, or you're oversimplifying it. And like, just at a general level, of course, there's nuances. But I think that is the case.
Yeah.
So what do we do when we're faced with that? As revolutionaries, as communists, like, of course, we're against the openly bigoted trend. But then also, we're also not feminists, So when this question comes up, okay, how do you combat misogyny? Okay, what do we do? How do we actually fight to defend women? How do we fight to defend girls? Well, we're not just going to go with the flow and answer, as a feminist do. Like, okay, look to the boss, go to the government, make policies, blah, 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 right? So you have these wrong answers. But what nobody looks at is underlying it. Like, why is this happening? Why is there huge mushrooming of the manosphere? And that's precisely where I think the job of Marxists has to be, to explain the ideological shifts in a materialist way. Right? Like,
this was going to be my follow-up question, actually, because I think it's undeniable what you're saying, the manosphere, the growth of misogyny in general that we're seeing among young people, but not only among young people. And it goes together with the growth of anti-immigrant sentiment, the growth of quite a chauvinist attitude, the growth of anti-trans or even anti-gay bigotry. So, and that was my question, why is this rising in general, and why is this rising particularly among young men? If you can maybe walk us through, and I think that's going to be also part of responding to what's the problem with liberals and feminists, but we can get there a bit down the road.
Yeah. I'll just say, like, there is a specific article that is in the issue called Crushing the Red Pill. Comrade Cassian wrote it. So that one specifically deals with the manosphere and tries to take up some of the arguments. But I think it just as a general approach, I can address a couple of your questions, which is really...
By the way, to our listener, the link to the entire issue will be in the description. It's a voluminous issue. There's I don't know how many articles, but about all those different subjects.
Apparently 34.
apparently 34 on all sorts of different subjects related to a bit what you were laying out. So sorry for the interruption. Why is the growth of the right and misogyny?
Yeah, I think I appreciate that you raised that, because obviously you can't understand any of the growth of misogyny and chauvinism, the exacerbation of these ideas. You can't, youth don't live in a bubble. So you look at what's happening in the world. Well, Trump, you have, I don't know, we can just name some of the ones we're talking about here in this issue. You have Milei in Argentina, you've got in Europe, you've got the AfD, which polls as which polls as the largest party amongst working class people. You've got Reform here. There's, I don't know, BJP
also in France.
Le Pen in France, Meloni. You've got Chile, right-wing guy, super pro-Trump guy, fan of Pinochet, who just won again. We're recording this on the 5th of May, and just yesterday the results in some important elections were announced in India. I was really sad that we couldn't write anything on India in this issue, but the BJP has come to power quite decisively in West Bengal, which was a bastion of the left for over 3 decades. And then, anyways, but you have this onward march of the right wing, and I think that's one of the things that we constantly hammer. And as Sparticists, we do on the show and in our press, that the right wing is growing. So you have a broader situation where the right wing is growing. So of course, that's going to have its parallel in terms of social attitudes. But again, that still doesn't answer the question of why. Why is the right wing growing? Because again, and this is where I think the role of Marxists really is decisive, because liberals will be like, oh, but the social media and the Murdoch press and whatever, So I think that's what we have to be able to explain. And that's what I try to do in this editorial. So again, people who haven't checked out the issue, so there's tons of articles in this. For me, I wrote the editorial. I was trying to trying to oversee all the different various articles and what really binds them together. And, all of them, to the extent that they all deal with polarizations and growing divisions and how to defend the oppressed and put forward actual counter arguments and answers for what to do, they all have in common this one thing, which is what's driving the growth of these polarizations. So I tried to explain that in my editorial, and I have the subhead, imperialist decline and rising reaction. That the overall right-wing shift internationally, can understand that without understanding what's happening in terms of U.S. hegemony being in crisis and what Trump and U.S. imperialism are doing to stay on top. And this is what we've been talking about since at least 2023, which is the decline of the liberal order and the death of liberalism, and why are the imperialists in the U.S. now making a break with liberalism, right? So I tried to explain how that process is actually driving the shift to the right.
Well, what's the link between young kids liking Andrew Tate and the decline of U.S. hegemony? I think that maybe is something if you can lay it out for our listeners.
Horrible, but I think a useful question. I mean, it's very, very. In a sense, there is a link. Actually, that was one of the points we were trying to make. That there is a link here. But okay, let me try and make sense.
I mean, if I can just say, we're talking about the rise of the right and stuff, and we mentioned earlier that the hatred against women, women's oppression of minorities have existed for, I don't know, centuries under capitalism. But it's undeniable that we're seeing a new uptick. And so I guess what came before that uptick? Were women better treated? But were these ideas against women, against gays, or against minorities disappeared for a certain period? So maybe we can talk about that liberal sort of era a little bit and what its downfall means in terms of the rise of the right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a bit of a provocative way to put it, which is, under the liberal post-Soviet period, were women better treated? Of course, the answer is no, but there was a difference. For instance, what do we mean when we're talking about liberalism constantly? I think this is one of the main questions or criticisms we get, which is, what do you mean by what's liberalism? Well, I think now it's maybe less of a mystery that liberalism is on its deathbed. But I think the post-Soviet period, the US became the hegemonic world power, and it didn't have anybody challenging it. anymore. So it didn't need like brute force, and it could plunder the world using all kinds of liberal values. So multiculturalism, open borders, pro-immigration. Immigration numbers skyrocketed, in the 90s, but like specifically the 2000s, like that were pro-immigrant, were pro-human rights, we care for women. Like, look at how they, what was one of their main ideological justifications for waging the war in Afghanistan? We're going to save the women, right? So the U.S. imperialists used these liberal ideals as a mask to cover up their plunder of the whole planet, their financial plunder of the whole planet under these really liberal ideas. Democracy, freedom of movement, freedom of people, the EU. Eventually, I think like they were a bit late on the same-sex question. It came out after 2008, the financial crisis, where they were like, okay, well, I guess we'll give this concession as well because the huge crisis has just erupted. So then it was the same-sex question. But I think as we explained in our last main article in the trans question, which is that the trans question is really where this limit hit, where it's like this really intersected this crisis, i.e. its declining economic position, but it still is this world hegemonic player. But economically, its material base has really been hollowed out. When we talk about liberalism, so of course, that's not to say women's conditions and the condition of the oppressed were better back then. But I think it did make an impact ideologically where, DEI, look at what Trump is doing right now to DEI, right? He's smashing it. Why? And you look at some of his arguments for why he's doing that. And he's using women, Black people, gay people, etc. And he's throwing them under the bus because he's like, oh, well, look at you guys benefited. So the imperialists were able to use identity politics, to, again, put a mask on their whole exploitation of the world. I don't know. Maybe that's too vague.
No, I think that's true. If you look at the 2000s or 2010s, you mentioned gay marriage, the whole LGBTQ movement, how it's been taken up by capitalist interests. Even banks would have,
pride,
gay pride
the
flag,
cops,
pride,
the big banks.
Yeah, and even or look at something like Black Lives Matter was embraced by a wing of the ruling class, the Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, taking the
with
knee,
the kente
etc.
cloth, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So the U.S. So you're saying that the U.S. ruling class used sort of liberal ideology to mask their, hegemony, plunder of the world, but now their liberalism is really in a crisis because the economic position of the U.S. is in decline, right? And is that where you get Trump and you get sort of a reaction?
I think what they're realizing is what they realized already is that, the post-Soviet period was also marked by what's called globalization, right? Anybody who went to university in the 2000s and 2010s, there were so many courses on globalization and it was Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, all of that, right? But what was that? It was international trade intensified, ratcheted up to new heights, integration of China into the world market and so on, which allowed it to become what it is today. But what that setup did is that it hollowed out the industrial base of the United States, because huge amounts of offshoring happened. So what you have a situation which you actually explained quite well. I was reading this the other day, and what we explain in the U.S. imperialism turns the screws in Spartacist, that you have a situation today where the U.S. is effectively still the hegemon. It controls the world's reserve currency, the control of the world's financial markets, and 750 military bases all around the world, right? So it's still top dog, but I think the American ruling class is very conscious now that this can't go on because they're not. There's not much underneath it, so they need to reindustrialize, right? That means that they need a different strategy. They need to break. They need to undo globalization. They need to reverse it. And what that ultimately means is that when it comes to the sphere of the superstructure, in the realm of ideology, they need to break with liberalism, because guess what? You can't have the free market world ideas, open border, blah, 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 with, you can't.
It's what's needed ideologically. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they
Now,
need
what
to
they
go back
need
to a
right
more...
now is to go on to a more offensive footing. They can't afford the liberal values anymore, which is what explains a right-wing shift. And it explains Trump, but it also explains a right-wing shift in general, like happening internationally. So that's the underlying material basis, so to speak, of the right-wing reaction. And within that, right, if you have openly president of the, world's more powerful country talking about all the stuff that he talks about, grab your whatever from his last presidency,
Yeah.
things like this, then that's going to send signals to people. And now this comes back to the second thing. And as I explained in the article, so you can have the crisis of U.S. hegemony, which is leading to, more offensive posture by the American ruling class, and which is also putting the squeeze on its allies as well as those countries that are subjugated to bow. But that doesn't necessarily explain why is there huge support behind this in terms of electoral result in terms of the MAGA base, in terms of, so why is that? And I think that, again, has to do with liberalism. So liberalism, it, as I was saying, it was a mask for plundering both the domestic population, but also internationally. The plunder was carried out under the guise of we're pro-women, we're pro-gay, we're pro the environment, we're pro everything under the sun of this liberal rainbow, right? So that made working populations really resentful of liberals and liberalism, because anytime they wanted to really oppose the status quo, the establishment would really throw these moralist blackmail in the faces about, what do you mean?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking that in Britain in the 2000s, there was a movement among working class people, which was called British Job for British Workers.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, this is like, chauvinistic slogan, obviously, but it was a slogan raised by workers who were seeing their factories being shut, and who were relocating. Yeah, who were relocated in other countries for cheap labor, or else even sometimes factories which would get immigrants from the EU and pay them, half the rate rather than hiring local people. So there was a big contradiction in that sentiment. Like there was a feeling of wanting to fight the loss of their job. And I remember reading our press and studying a bit that issue, all the left and a lot of the far left really condemned those workers, saying racist, this is you're just bigot, and etc. And I think this really sowed the seeds for what we're going to see later on with Brexit, with the growth of support of reform. These workers have been labeled bigots, racist, and the only party that sort of welcomed them are these right-wing parties.
Precisely. And, in a sense, what you're just laying out is a polarization of a different kind. But back then, it's like you're either for British jobs or for unemployment. Like, why is this a choice that a worker is being offered right now? Like, if you want to fight for your job to stay, all of a sudden you are a reactionary bigot who's against immigrants. Yeah. That's just not the case. But the fact that there were no other alternatives on offer is really what made that polarization and that narrative set in place. Anytime today you talk about Brexit in this country, anybody who's for Brexit is like, oh, you're a racist. It's like, why is that the only understanding of Brexit that exists out there? Because the liberals dominated it, it's the same thing. So whether it's the fight against offshoring or, whether or I think the green question, the shutting down of factories because of the green agenda. I don't think that's happened so much in the United States. Maybe. I know it's been a thing here recently. But it's, again, Germany. Workers hate that stuff. Like 7 different recycling bins or whatever. But like you are slashing jobs, but you're doing this under these sort of liberal ideals. And you're telling workers, not only are you going to lose your job, but you're going to be happy because you
should be happy. Yeah,
you should be happy because if you speak out against it, you're a horrible person who wants to destroy the environment, or you're against black and brown people. It's like, well, no. But I think this is precisely where the left has been totally unarmed and horrible on this question, which is like always choosing between the more liberal status quo and the bad option, so the lesser evil, which is always the liberal status quo. So that's kind of what's got us here.
But that explains working class support for right-wing parties, for Trump, for the AFD. What about youth? Like, because young people are, the stereotype is like they're a bit more left-wing. They're more like, I don't know, prone to revolutionary ideas. You know, they don't have a mortgage. So like, why is the right-wing ideas growing among teenagers?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And again, to some extent, the next episode, which I've already recorded with Comrade Felix, he goes into this a little bit about youth see no future. Now, I think it's a bit of a left bubble thing to say that youth are just more left-wing or more revolutionary. I think this is really not the case. I think this is a case if you think the world is the campus. It's just not true. But even amongst students, you know, it'll be the social sciences and liberal arts kids who'll be more open to progressive ideas. It will not be the STEM people who are totally down with what's going on in terms of slashing funding of, like, you know, the liberal arts programs and so on and so forth. But look, I don't know. I think there's different questions and different factors driving that in different countries. I don't know the details, but I do think it's undeniable. For example, when we're doing photo research for the issue, Nigel Farage has a lot of appeal amongst Gen Z men, and this is validated by polling data and so on and so forth. And the AFD appeals to young men. Le Pen appeals to young men. They all orient to young men as well. And I think this is, again, why is that? So you have a situation where young people today are facing an increasingly bleak future. I think that's pretty clear for everybody to see. Like, you know, you can't really trust that path which your parents and which society had for you. Like, you graduate and you go to university and then you come out with a degree. And even if it's like a degree in, I don't know, archaeology or something, you still get a job. Like, it's just so not the case anymore. You'll have Oxford grads who apply to 300 jobs and still don't get anything after, 6 months, because guess what? Their degree is in something that the bourgeoisie doesn't care about. It's no longer useful to them. So I think one is that the future is increasingly bleak. I think there's, look, you've had decades of austerity. You've had the cost of living crisis in a lot of the Western countries. You have a situation where youth, especially working class youth, they are growing up in a situation where things are not pleasant. So it makes them hate their existence, their conditions of existence. You grow up in estates where you're going to totally bankrupt schools, where everything is set up against you and it just feels like a prison. So you want to revolt against something. I think that's another factor. You want to, when you want to revolt and you don't see any other options except the right as the anti-status quo option, that's who you're going to look to. Especially, and this is, I think, the other important thing, which is why we're seeing more right-wing trends amongst young men, which is, and again, that article, Youth See No Future, kind of does a nice job in explaining this, which is, masculinity was vilified for decades under liberalism, right? Where you have to crush your own masculinity in order to not be offensive. Your existence, just as a man was almost seen to be offensive to women. I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating that, but I think it also became a thing where just because you're white and you're male, you're just somehow, you carry evil as you walk and you're you're an offense to society. I think that also is fueling that backlash because people are like, well, guess what? Look at my life. I don't have much going on. So at least these guys are saying that this is a way to reclaim my manliness or manhood. Now, of course, they have completely reactionary answers, all right? They lace that with anti-Semitism, complete bigotry and all of that stuff. But again, it's really speaking to the huge erosion of masculinity and I think the social hollowing out of entire societies and the fact that the future also doesn't look good. So then that's why the manosphere appeals to young men, because they're like, oh, well, this means that this is how I become a man. This is how this is how I feel good about myself. And that's a dead end answer too, of course. But then you have to understand why does it appeal, right?
Yeah. I think to combat it, that's the key, is to appeal it. And I think the problem, and we can get a bit into those things, but just before that, for me, what you just said reminds me, I remember hearing Joe Rogan, the right-wing podcaster 2 years ago, saying that today, if you want to rebel, if you want to revolt, if you want to reject the status quo, you go to the right, you don't go to the left.
Yeah.
And I was quite shocked hearing this, and I was like, gosh, like there's some truth in there actually, because it becomes
completely
sort of,
true.
Official ideology, this sort of liberal, white privilege and all that stuff. And in a sense that right-wing reaction is both a reaction to horrible living conditions, but also a backlash against liberalism, like enough, and a rebellion to this. And then the liberals are still, obviously they're still around, and their answer to this is what? It's like more moralizing or well, give a bit, maybe maybe we can get a bit into how does the left try to solve this growth of the right, try to solve those polarizations a little bit.
Well, look, we don't deal with the feminists so much in this issue. And again, like there is so much to be said about this question. And we're just like talking about one specific example here. For example, I was talking to my friend, she's in her late 20s. And, we talked a lot about this question, manosphere and the feminists and the backlash and so on. And, what do the feminists do? They rightly hate this, of course. But then their answer is I'm talking about the really sort of extreme expressions of this, which is to stop dating men, boycott men. Some don't even talk to men anymore. Like it's really demoralized. And in South Korea, for example, there's a whole movement, I think it's called the 4B movement, where women are just choosing to not engage in relationships because they think men just suck. And this is a very, very traditional society. Anybody who's seen any kind of K-drama will see the woman question is staring you right in the face of just the chauvinism and the violence and so on and so forth. So that's the extreme answer. But it is what is it? It's to farther remove yourself from the problem, or it's to double down on the same thing. So it's to just become a little just more feminist, become more liberal. I think this is what we see a lot, for example, in the United States with the MAGA supporters and the pro-Democrat people, that they're just deplorables, and you just shun them and you just vilify them without understanding why do they look to Trump. And I think it's a similar dynamic with the feminist reaction to the manosphere, which is they're just all rotten, bankrupt men, which is, I'm sorry, there's a difference between a 13-year-old who might think Andrew Tate is kind of has a point and, an older guy who's like, I love Tate. Like a 13-year-old needs to be argued with, right? So, I think the answer is just you double down. But, the answer is just to double down on the same thing and not draw the lessons and not understand that actually this right-wing shift is a complete backlash to the entire liberal order. And that takes expression in the capital P political terrain with all these right-wing parties, but in the social, everyday life, it takes place in the growth of anti-trans sentiment, the growth of anti-immigrant sentiment, Tommy Robinson, Charlie Kirk, and the manosphere and all of these things. And I think it's to just not understand what's driving that. And if you can't understand that, if you can't draw those lessons, then you're just gonna in a sense, I understand that the liberals are under the gun now, and I can understand that. But I think for us, the problem is more so with the left, which is what does the left do? And I think the left, as you just said, it is basically indistinguishable from the status quo, from the liberals. So our problem is not so much with the average woman walking down the street who's a hardened feminist, but it's more so with the left who isn't able to offer an answer to this. Because when I was reading all about this, I went around and looked at all the left. What do they have to say about this? And they all have, to one extent or another, written one thing or another about the culture wars. But often, what's a common answer? It's class war, not culture war. Okay. What am I supposed to do with this? It's you're preaching okay, let's just fight the bosses, but let's not fight the cultural issues. Well, yeah, I'd love to fight the bosses, but guess what? All these different divisions hold back an actual struggle against the boss. So it's very abstract. It's very class war, not culture war. That's one trend. But I think the other trend is equally, you're just a socialist feminist. You're just feminist and you don't draw any of the lessons, then you're just you can't question immigration at all. And I know this is a thing that we've dealt with in Britain, for example, a lot. Like if you even question the fact that immigration may have been a problem, it's like, oh well, all of a sudden you're a racist. That is how liberals deal with it. That's not how the Marxist left should deal with this. But unfortunately, this is their methods. So
you just said something that the left is indistinguishable from like the status quo. But can I just push back on this? Because, just the people who defend the status quo don't say class war, right? They don't say like, or they don't say like socialist but in the mind of a lot of leftists, that point that we keep saying that they're like in line with the status quo, it doesn't work for many because you read the paper of every leftist and you're going to read about the need for socialism and how capitalism is terrible. And I'm sure all those culture war articles you're talking about all probably have some sentences about how this is a product of capitalism and capitalism is bad and we need to replace capitalism with socialism. And that, okay, but why is that? Why does that doesn't work? Like, why is that not a good answer to this polarization we just talked about?
I think that's a fair question. Let me try and answer that, but maybe I'll be successful, maybe not. You can tell me. I think one thing we have to be very clear about is you have to distinguish what is written on a piece of paper and what the actions of what actually happens on the ground. Like there's a difference between what your propaganda says and what you actually push on the ground. And I mean, there's innumerable examples, but you can be for, or it can even be in the same propaganda. You can be for socialism and then you can say vote for the Green Party. And guess what? The Greens are liberals. So there's that, right? It's like you can have your red phraseology, but then when it comes to what do you do today, it can totally jive with vote for the Greens. The other thing about like in being indistinguishable from the status quo, like, maybe I overgeneralize, like, okay, you can have groups like the RCP, for instance, the Revolutionary Communist people, who will say very red things, but they're also the types who will say class war, not culture war. It's like, okay, fine. But by not providing an answer to the actual problems, it leaves a problem intact. Now, I know that's not quite the same thing as saying, well, they're indistinguishable from the status quo. But I would argue there's a case to say that. Because what do they have to offer in the concrete? Nothing. Other than like a red slogan, which doesn't actually intersect anything. I was walking home today from work. I saw a lot of posters saying, you need revolution to end racism. Like, okay, if I'm a college student, maybe I'll be like, oh, cool, I'll check out that meeting. But most people will be like, what are you talking about? Maybe I've got that wrong. But I think it's like, saying things that are in the clouds, but not having any answers. And then to the extent that there are answers, they don't cut any ice and do anything to build a unity and actually break down those divisions. That would be my best attempt at answering you, but you tell me.
No, I think I agree with you over the answer. You have to offer answer, and the left is on the defensive, the liberals even are on the defensive. The right is ascendant. And when you were talking, I was reminded, and I was looking it up, the article the Spartacist League US wrote about Charlie Kirk, which many of the points that are in that article are also in multiple articles in the Issue of Women in Revolution. And when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, we produced an article saying Kirk still needs to be proved wrong. Charlie Kirk, his old thing was to go on campus and say, like, prove me wrong type thing. And engage in debates. And most leftists, I believe, in the US, maybe I'm mistaken, but most leftists, their policy is like, Kirk's a fascist, we don't talk to him. And you just yell fascist and racist at him. And meanwhile, Charlie Kirk was becoming really popular among young people because he was speaking their frustration, trying to explain in a totally reactionary, horrible way, that trying to give an explanation to their problem and why their life is miserable. And as Marxists, as leftists in this context, you can't just scream like racist or whatever. You have to actually answer those arguments and develop answers which are not just you're a fascist, you're a racist, or which are not just you need a revolution to end racism, right? Both of which are are wrong and doesn't make any headways. I could put this article again also in the description, but the comrades tried to go through some of the most controversial, honestly, assertion of Kirk about like affirmative action, about like the civil rights movement, and what they do, the right, is usually they take like a grain of truth and then expand on it and drive it in a really reactionary direction. Like on immigration, that's always what they do. You know, they'll take a grain of truth. Like they'll start by saying, you've been lied to. You know, the ruling class has promised this and they haven't delivered. And immigration has put pressure on like housing prices or public services. There's a truth to this. And then they really push it into saying, well, if we get rid of immigration, you'll get better services and hospital and housing, actually. And that's actually where it becomes, no, that's not true at all, actually. Because the main source is capitalist profit, austerity, etc. And removing immigrants is actually going to make everything worse. But you have to be able to untangle those things, or else, as you say, you will just look as if you're defending the status quo. If you just scream racist at some of those people, you look, you're defending the government or something. So I do agree with your point.
No, I'm glad you raised that as an example. There's a couple of things I want to say in response to that. I think that method of not dealing with figures like Charlie Kirk. I mean, in this issue, we have a little MAGA package, and it's written by Comrade Olive Schul, and it's direct. I think the left would hate those two articles. You know what those two articles are? What are they called? The left must win MAGA workers. Like that article would be hated by so much of the left. The left
and
must,
the second one
is the left must win MAGA women too. Sorry, I'm just trying to find I can't find it.
It's page 34.
Oh, right here. The left must win MAGA workers, and then the left must win MAGA women too. And like, there's a reason why we wrote these articles, because guess what? Like, huge layers. Like, I know right now the Iran war is making a lot of the MAGA base angry, true, but just one bad war isn't going to be enough. Like, those ideas aren't going to disappear. Maybe they'll hate Trump, but they're not going to all of a sudden become liberals overnight because of the war, right? So you have the situation where you've got a huge segment of the country which is right-wing. So guess what? A lot of them are workers. A lot of them are in the unions. A lot of them are your co-workers. You got to do something about it. And especially women. I mean, for me, this article is actually around the time of Charlie Kirk, where I started to make myself more aware about what this Charlie Kirk thing was around the time of his death, because I wasn't super aware. And I was watching a bunch of his videos, and what shocked me was just droves of young college women with MAGA hats and Charlie Kirk hats, they love Charlie Kirk. And I was like, oh my God, why? Why is this happening? Look at everything he's saying. And they would love it so much when these liberals would get totally trashed by Charlie Kirk. And for me, I'm just like, oh my God, do you not understand that this is against your interests? Why are you're a woman. These guys are anti-abortion. They're anti-blah, blah, blah, blah. But in my head as a leftist, like, okay, that's like an outrage. But there's a reason why they're out there backing Charlie Kirk or Trump, So I'm like, well, we have a duty here to do something, and especially with this left-winning MAGA women article. We specifically chose a photo of women workers. This is from Sunbury, Pennsylvania, but women workers for Trump. Right? So it's like, well, we have a responsibility. We need to build a union. We need to strengthen the unions. We need to win our co-workers. So if you want to do that class war and not do the culture war, but let's get our friends on our side. So you have to orient to these layers and not just disregard them as deplorable, backward bigots, And so I think that's just one thing I had to say on this. The other thing about when you said Charlie Kirk, we actually just, one of the recently published things on the website is an exchange, actually, on the question of Charlie Kirk. We had a letter questioning why we even wrote that article, because to even try and address Charlie Kirk and his arguments was itself a concession to the right wing. And Cairo, I've had her on the show several episodes ago. She wrote the article how the Black struggle was destroyed by liberalism, and she takes the time to really explain to the writer, whose name is Dawn. She takes the time to explain why we needed to actually take that up, because his ideas are still out there and they need to be defeated. And you can't just leave them intact. And it's not a concession to the right wing. In fact, it's a way to try and give the left some tools with which to go, have intelligent arguments with the right wing. Right? I think that was the other thing. And, without doing that, what happens is that not only do they pick on that grain of truth, as you said, but they're able to set the terrain of discussion. Which is a problem, And I think we saw that here with Brexit. We see that on the trans question, the first question, like, oh, what's a woman? It's like, well, why is that the question? And then liberals, they don't understand anything. And they just start talking about like chromosomes. And before you know it, nothing makes sense to anybody and everybody hates everybody else. And meanwhile, the trans movement is on, being crushed. So it's like, well, no, that's not the proper terrain of discussion. So we actually have a responsibility to intervene into these thorny debates and polarizations and take the right head on. But I think this is kind of the next part of the discussion, which is how do you take it on? So yeah.
So yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to approach this. Like, what would you recommend to some leftists that are listening and that either work with, I don't know, MAGA or right wing people who have those ideas, or young people who in school have friends who are interested in Andrew Tate and the sort of anti-woman idea, but that deep down they're like decent people who are just sort of confused. What sort of, obviously we can't respond to every single argument, but like maybe you can just give a general approach, a method, how to, what you should do and shouldn't do.
Yeah. I will be very general because I think one thing about this discussion is every few minutes or so, I'm like, oh my God, if somebody's listening to this and they're like, you guys are just so bending to the right wing, I think that's a huge pressure, like, I'll just be honest.
I mean, but what have we said that's capitulatory?
But it speaks to, what it speaks to? Of course, like, we got to battle that, right? But I think the fact that pressure exists speaks to where the left is at, right? Which is that it is considered sinful to even be trying to take on right-wing arguments or to even make the point that, hey, they're reacting to a legitimate problem. The legitimate problem being the wholesale rot of societies, right? Like, let's be clear, So anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there. So look, what I tried to put forward here, right? So the article I wrote was called How to Fight for the Future. And it's trying to provide a framework to the left for what to do about these polarizations. Like, you've got a situation where you've got, a zero-sum game, right? You've got these polarizations that are growing. You have to first understand what's driving them. And I think that was some of our discussion on how the decline of U.S. hegemony has to do with a 13-year-old liking Andrew Tate. Excellently put, but it's true. So there's that, right? So what's actually driving this? You have to obviously understand that as it plays out in, given the dynamics of different countries and so on and so forth. But then it's like, okay, what do we do about it? If we also become, quote, indistinguishable from the left, what this will do is it will keep these divisions intact, and it will keep the whole class on the back foot. Because what we need to do, I think, like one of the main lessons of Leninism is how do you build the unity of the proletariat? So it's like, that's our concern. That's our starting point. And you can talk about the proletariat, you can talk about young people. Guess what? I mean, young people are going to go into the working class, or hopefully a lot of them should. It's another separate thing in the issue. But anyways, so how do you bridge those divisions? What I tried to do was provide a general, overall theoretical framework for how to combat reaction. And I think there's like basically two steps, if you will. I think for me, one thing, anybody who's never read it or who has read it but hasn't read it for a while, read or reread Trotsky's Their Morals and Ours. It's excellent, especially in today's climate where, as I was just reacting to the pressure of the left, but like, you got to read Their Morals and Ours because it's a really good materialist explanation for why there's no such thing as like universal ideas that exist, in time and space, divorced from everything. Like there's no such thing as democracy, like capital D forever, or, freedom or whatever. Now, these are abstractions. These are not real things. So yeah, Trotsky does this really nice job of explaining morality, because this is what we're talking about. That we're talking about the fact that these culture wars, their motor force is like this fight over morals. Are you for immigrants? Are you against immigrants? Are you for this? Or are you against that? Are you for, whatever? So it's like, let's understand a Marxist, a materialist approach to morality. And Trotsky does a really nice job explaining that. And I'd just like to read out a quote, if I can, which I cite here. It's from Their Morals and Ours, and he says, whoever does not care to return to Moses, Christ, or Muhammad, whoever is not satisfied with eclectic hodgepodges, must acknowledge that morality is a product of social development, that there is nothing immutable about it, that it serves social interests, that these interests are contradictory, that morality, more than any other form of ideology, has a class character, right? So you take that understanding and you apply it to liberalism, all these sort of liberal values that we were talking about earlier. They have a class character. There's a reason why we bang on about the fact that liberalism was the ideology of the US empire in a given historic period, right? So you understand that, well, okay, if you're going to fight, if you've understood what's driving reaction, then you can't fight it with the tools of liberalism, which are the tools of the US ruling class, of all the ruling classes in a given period. So you have to basically take a stand and distinguish yourselves from liberalism and liberals. That's a basic starting point, because if you can't extract yourself from this polarization, then you're just going to end up fueling it. So that's one, understanding that morality has a class character, right? You have to distinguish yourself from liberals. But of course, you have to fight the pressures that are growing, which is right-wing pressures, right? Anti-woman pressures, anti-trans pressures, anti-immigrant pressures. So you have to fight those. So how I sort of imagine it is really in this climate, it's like balancing on a political tightrope. Where it's pressures of the right, pressures of liberals. And that's not to say that they're both equal pressures. It depends on your concrete circumstances, industries, workplaces, etc. But you got pressures. And they'll both act on you. And it's easy to bend to one or the other. So how do you not bend to either pressure? And again, this is going to sound very, very general, but it's to understand, again, the starting point, which is how do you build a unity of the proletariat? Okay, so this is where I found reading Lenin on religion quite useful.
Yes, it's amazing.
Yeah, and in a sense, we reprinted Lenin's piece. It's called Approach of the Workers' Party to Religion in the last issue as well, because we thought it went really well with the article on the trans question. But really, it really is indispensable for understanding how do you fight the influence of backward ideas amongst the working class and amongst the oppressed, because of course they exist. And that's not just talking about today, it's talking in general. Backward ideas exist. If you think people are just gonna pop out, and confront you with just pure good ideas, or you're not gonna talk to anybody, you're not gonna have any friends. Anybody who's been in the working class a day knows that, right? So why is the framework for religion really useful? I think the point with religion is that you wouldn't go around talking to any devout person, shouting at them to become atheist, right? If you're a communist, your starting point is not going to be oh, well, I have to convince you to become an atheist now, because how does that advance building the unity of the proletariat? How does that advance a class struggle? It doesn't. In fact, you end up on, again, stupid debates about whether or not God exists and materialism and idealism and so on. And those might be interesting to philosophy professors, but they're not what you got to do on the job, right? So what do we try and do? Well, our job really has to be to try and bring shared material interests to the forefront of discussions, and to not conduct ourselves in a way that inflame existing divisions and prejudices, which exist, So we have to fight to put what's common first and try and not inflame existing divisions. Now, as I say that, I'm conscious that somebody might be listening and say, okay, well, you're just saying you got to ignore the bad stuff and just focus on the fact. Yeah. That's a fair point. But I think it helps to be concrete. It helps to be concrete because I'm certainly not advocating like, okay, well, you can just,
ignore racism in the name of building unity, right?
Yeah, because that's economism and that doesn't work as well. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it helps to be concrete. So the way I got around that problem, which you were trying to refer to, was I just gave a bit of an example. Let's make it very concrete. So the example I used was, okay, you have divisions, which is a huge question here. You have migrants and refugees, and you have white workers. And it will become very quickly very polarized along anti-immigrant lines. So the left goes and they're like, we're for refugees, all the white workers are racist, and you'll just have this polarization. So how do you cut through this? So I use that as an example. Why? Because I think it illustrates something in terms of a dynamic. And this has to be concrete and depending on what you're confronting. And that's why the issue... Yeah, I think reading the rest of the issue helps. So, the example I used was in lots of Western countries, governments will, their policies of decades of high immigration numbers, they will take migrants and they'll dump them in completely deindustrialized, underfunded, completely, deprived by austerity towns. And they'll put them up in hotels, and that immediately invites the backlash by local populations. Why? Because the idea is like, oh, well, they don't do anything. They don't have jobs. They're just using benefits and they're, using our tax dollars and they're being put up in hotels. Meanwhile, our school, it doesn't even have enough teachers, or the NHS doesn't work. There's one bus a week, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a recipe for divisions, and which is, as I argue, what these governments want. So what do we do in that situation? How should the left approach it? You can go there like, for example, Stand Up to Racism does, and they say, we do defend refugees. We do. Of course we do. But the problem here is there is a shared material interest here. The refugees have no interest in being isolated in this hotel, surrounded by a sea of hostile locals. And the locals have an interest in having better infrastructure, in having a better town. But, they both have a shared interest in this. Refugees don't want to be, they want to be integrated. Yeah. So that's the shared material interest. So how do you fight for that? Because the one hand you could go and be like, refugees versus racists, or you can say, right, this is what we need. Let's figure out how to fight for this. And how do you fight for that? And you would take a clear side in defense of immigrants, and you would put forward a program that shows, okay, well, look, this is a problem that the government's making, right? To actually integrate the refugees, but also improve schools for refugee kids, but also like the locals' kids, you need more funding. Where's that going to come from? It's a Labour government. Okay, what's the Labour government doing? Why is that a problem? Et cetera, et cetera. You got to make that fight. This is how you're going to concretely build that unity and do it in opposition to the actual forces that act as a brake on everything, and who have that interest in keeping the population divided, right? So that's a concrete example. Nowhere does it say that we're just going to we're just going to put the differences to the side. In fact, we're going to make very clear, like, look, actually, to the locals, that it's in your interest to defend the refugees, because by fighting for what they need, you'll actually also be fighting to improve your own situation, right? And that's how you build concrete unity. But...
And the issue, if I can just, you were talking about Lenin and going around about, are you an atheist or not? If you apply that to the immigration, and it's a lot what the left does, it's like going around people and asking, do you like immigrants? Yes or no? And it's like, it poses it in like this sort of moral, do you like foreigners in your heart, like rather than putting it on the terrain of the class struggle against the government and saying, here's what we need to better our lot, And obviously, it's not going to help us if we're pitted against foreign-born and native-born workers. We're much better fighting together, and by always bringing back the terrain of the class struggle, that's how I think you can at least start unlocking those polarization, and then fight also backward consciousness. Like racist stuff prevents the unity of foreign-born workers with native-born. I mean, it's kind of basic in a certain sense.
Yeah, and I think
the other
that's...
point...
Sorry, yeah.
If I can just make one little last point, another point that I've noticed working around the liberal left or talking to more right-wing workers, there's a contradiction in people who look to the right. They're angry at the status quo. Honestly, just recognizing that anger, saying, yes, you are correct to be angry. The system is totally broken. It goes a long way than just, being a liberal, just saying, oh, you're being racist and oh, no. And when you start with that, you can make much more headways into like, here's why you're angry and here's why what you're proposing is not going to solve it. Anyway.
Yeah. Again, I'll just reference back those MAGA articles. One of them, the Left Must Win MAGA Workers, it has actual tips for how should militant workers in their workplace approach workers with backward ideas. And it's like, well, if you're going to open with, hey, what do you think about immigration? That's probably not going to be, because that whole terrain is already set, right? Let's make it concrete about, hey, how do we fight to improve our condition on the job? How do we increase the influence of the union against the boss, etc. And in the course of those things, I think this is one thing which really is a lesson of Marxism, but is like forgotten constantly, which is divisions break apart in the course of struggle. But so the job of Marxists has to be to find ways of building that struggle, right? And providing a road for how to conduct it. And I think by conducting it on the terrains of the liberals, it's a recipe for failure because it
introduces new divisions.
Yeah, and I think it's very simple. And again, it might sound really, really general, but I encourage listeners to just be patient. Think about this as you go about confronting like political questions. Your starting point should be, how do you build a unity of the class? Like for every question, like that needs to be the starting point. And very quickly, the bankruptcy of liberal ideas will become apparent because it's impossible to do that with liberalism. And
I mean, it remains general, but I think it helps me. It gives food for thought, and I think listeners should really go have a look at some of those articles we've talked about and more. I don't know if you want to bring this to a close. Is there any other article or topics you think we should at least flag and briefly discuss before we?
Well, look, let me just look. I know we've been talking for a while. I'll start wrapping this up. But look, so this is. I'll just say about this issue. The huge number of comrades collaborated on this issue in putting out the different articles. We also, for the first time, have an ed board, and I hope to have some of those comrades in future episodes to talk in depth in some of the different articles. I'll just motivate very quickly. So even our discussion, it wasn't very much on youth, but everything we've said applies exactly to the question of youth. So a lot of our articles are on youth. So there's just an article explaining what is youth oppression, how do you approach that as a materialist, conscription in Germany, which young people might be facing soon, schools in Britain, AI, which is impacting young people lots. It's, future social media bans, which is becoming an increasingly common weapon in the arsenal of the bourgeoisies and parents of how to regiment kids, youth in China. So there's a lot of articles on youth. But on top of that, so I already talked about the red pill stuff. There's MAGA stuff. We got a couple articles on the trans question, the LGBTQ+. One is a debate we had with the CPGB here in Britain. It's called Communism and Trans Liberation. The other one's an article on the left party Die Linke in Germany and how that is a break on the struggle for LGBTQ plus people. There's an article on Greece, growing violence against women in Greece. What do you do about that? How do you fight? Argentina, women under attack in Malays, Argentina, Philippines. I think I'll just say a couple of things. This short package on industry. There's this murder of a tradeswoman, Amber Check, that happened last year, which is a complete outrage. Basically, her coworker bludgeoned her to death, with a sledgehammer on the job. She's 20. Gosh. And I think it was also a very anti-gay thing. But, he said, like, I just didn't like her. And he just killed her. And this is something that happened on the job, and it's like, well, what do you do in that? So we have a little package built around Amber Check, including an interview with Emily Turnbull. You wrote a little short piece on Lucy Letby, nurse who's been scapegoated here for the failures of the NHS. But look, the two articles I think we do need to flag for anybody who's listening is on sex and abuse. People on the left, people familiar with the ICL will know that we, for a very long time, had this position of blanket opposition to all age of consent laws. This was a position which did not sit right with many, to put it mildly. It invited the ire of many others. But we have an article, a long, in-depth article correcting that position. So, but, it goes broader than that. It's not just a correction. It is a correction, but it goes broader than that to really understand why our approach was wrong. And so it's trying to undertake the question of youth and sexuality from a Marxist point of view. Like, how should we understand the whole question of sexuality amongst youth, which is a very complex question that communists have our job isn't to play God and talk about what's right or wrong and what the age of consent should be, that this is a very murky gray area, and that we were wrong basically to have a blanket opposition, especially in today's climate where, we're not living in the heyday of the sexual revolution of the 60s and so on in the West, where today, youth are actually far more conservative than older people, and they see age of consent laws as a protection, especially in a climate that's marked by Epstein. I forgot to say, we also have an article on Epstein. The other is we also have a related correction on Roman Polanski. We defended Roman Polanski for a very long time. Now we no longer do, and we explain why that is. So those two things are also in there. But look, all in all, big issue. Lots of fun articles. If I can just say one last thing. Look, I know people probably don't read things in paper, like in print anymore, but a huge amount of work goes into producing a print issue, especially if listeners are familiar with our publications like Spartacus, Women Revolution, Black History, like they're beautiful works of art. Honestly, the front page is actually painted. It was a painting done by a comrade. And so that's one. But, even if you don't want to buy a paper copy, download the PDF and look at it. It's absolutely stunning. And I want to give a huge shout out to the whole comp team in New York, especially Comrade Francois, and everybody else who worked on this. Absolutely stunner of an issue. Yeah,
It looks really good.
And I learned so much just from what goes into creating a publication like this. Just the thought behind photo pics. What photos do we select? Where should they go on a piece? On a page, on a spread, etc. So just all in all, really proud, really pleased with the outcome of this issue. Please go check it out. We will be having events launching this, introducing this. In London, we're going to have that this coming weekend. I think there's one happening in New York at the end of the month. But, if you can have one, gather your friends. Go to a cafe, have a little event, but get in touch with us about your comments, about your feedback, because a lot of our blood, sweat, and tears go into this stuff, and we want to do this to provide answers to make an impact. So let us know what you thought. And
most definitely. Cool. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time.
And to our listeners, like the video, share the video as well. It helps grow the podcast.
It's not a video.
Share the link. That's true. Because I do video, so I get used to video. Sorry. But share the link or share the audio. Make sure to follow us as well if you're not following us.
And please do. I'm very bad at this. Please follow us. Send it to your friends. Send it to people.
Yes, send it to a friend. All right, so I'll put all the info in the description. Have a look. The issue of Women in Revolution is there, and probably a few more bits. And yeah, so
Cool.
all right. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep, and your vote is